So today I want to find out how The Witcher 3 runs on my old rig, because I want to use that data to then cross-reference it with the upcoming Cyberpunk 2077. So my PC is a 4790K processor with a stock cooler, so stock clocks. We got 16 gigs of RAM in it, running at 1866 megahertz, and the video card is an XFX R9 390 with 8 gigs of video RAM. None of it is overclocked. Now, we are running Windows 10 Pro on an SSD, so we do have that going for us. We're going to get into these benchmarks. We're going to see how the game runs, because the way that I've set it up is I do the same run through like a little town in The Witcher 3, and then end up with some enemies which drop the FPS in every single test that I've run. So I'm going to be disappearing, and I'm going to be giving you some updates during each benchmark and give you my findings. Now, before we get started, the on-screen numbers are set up as follows in the top left corner of each run. Of course, you see the XFX R9 390, DD is the double dissipation. First value is the GPU temp, then we have the GPU load, and then we have the VRAM usage. Then you got my processor, you got the CPU temperature, the CPU load, and the clock, which varies because it has a boost clock up to 4.4 gigahertz. Then the RAM, how much RAM is being used. I got 16 gigs of RAM, so you can see how much of it is being used. And then the FPS, which shows the current FPS, the average FPS, and then the 1% low FPS. So let's get started. This is the first run where I've set everything to the lowest setting possible at 1080p with all post-processing turned off. Now, riding into the village, we see the grass and all other small items kind of fade into view. The texture detail is low, however, so you kind of see everything look a little bit soft. My setup has zero problems running at this level, and we see that we're running over 100 FPS throughout this entire course, essentially. It is only towards the end where the FPS drops below 100 when multiple enemies come into view. We still end up with 110 average FPS and a 1% low FPS of 90. Now, the second setting is default medium settings and default medium post-processing. The draw distance is increased, and at this level it doesn't detract anymore. Like the previous one, you really saw everything pop into view. Now you no longer get that as much. Detail is enhanced too. You can actually see some of the details on Geralt's clothing properly now, and the weeds on the ground are way more plentiful.
Then both forces attacked, one from either side.
We are running over 80 FPS now, and sometimes even dipping into the 90s. And this is honestly the first setting that I would call acceptable to play. The low setting, definitely not, but this is a good start. The FPS again drops sharply when the enemies come into view, and we end up with 86 average FPS and a 1% low FPS of 72. Now, the third setting is the default high settings with the high post-processing settings. We again see another bump in the draw distance and the detail. The world looks way more complete when you look at the distance, and up close the ground covering is again enhanced. Now this is also the setting that in my opinion the game really starts to look beautiful. It is also where my rig is starting to struggle to keep 60 frames. The FPS does stay at a solid 60 most of the way, but again, the moment we run into the enemies further up ahead, the hit brings us down to the low 50s. To me, still acceptable, and I would have no problem playing with these settings at all. Now this is the fourth setting. We are at default ultra settings and high post processing. There is no ultra post processing. We are again seeing another bump in draw distance. The forests in the distance look full and lush with trees. The ground covering looks awesome, and the detail on Geralt is better than ever. You probably already noticed that my rig is no longer able to run the game at 60 FPS, and we instead have to feel good about mid-40s. Personally, I'm starting to call this unplayable. Full disclosure though, I've played the entirety of Crysis back in the day in sub 60 FPS and had fun. But since then I've become a little bit of a snob and I'm trying to get and stay as close to 60 FPS as possible while eking the most amount of detail out of a game. So now we get to the end and the FPS drops to just below 40, ending up with an average 44 FPS and a 1% low FPS of 38. Now of course I'm a glutton for punishment. This is the fifth run at ultra settings, post-processing everything on the highest setting. Couldn't leave well enough alone and pretty much ticked all the boxes. So this is how all the big boys played this game back in 2015, or now the people with more current hardware, higher end graphics card.
Then both forces attacked, one from either side. Cavalry swooped in from the wood.
We are dropping frames to the low 40s this time, which is definitely not on my list of things to do when I'm playing video games. And I honestly have a hard time discerning the difference between this one and the previous detail levels. It looks just a tad bit more detailed, but it could also be in my head. At the end of the road, we lose another 2 frames when the enemies rear their ugly heads. The average FPS is now 41, and the 1% low FPS ends up at 36. Ripperino. Now the sixth one is my personal settings, where I have turned all post-processing off and selected the default high settings. So this is the personal setting I feel most comfortable with. We are now seeing high FPS most of the way, and sometimes you see that the FPS actually ends up in the low 70s. It's a gain of a few FPS over using the high post-processing in the previous runs, and I personally do not miss it. It also helps that I personally prefer sharper looking games, so filters to soften edges or bloom are not really necessary for me. You do get to miss some of the fancy lighting effects where the sun kind of goes through the trees and stuff like that. So at the end of the road, we are again meeting the enemies, and we dip in the mid-50s when the enemies come into view. The average FPS is 67, a 1% low FPS is at 55. Extremely playable in my book, and that is it. So I took a couple of screenshots at each setting at roughly the same area. You can now see how the detail increases at each step, and finally then my personal setting, which is a very noticeable downgrade from the ultra setting that you saw before. But then here's the lowest of the low, so there's about as much of a difference between my setting and the low setting as there is between my setting and the ultra setting. So we're back. Conclusion. I did notice throughout that entire run, every single time, the GPU is pretty much utilized 100% and my CPU is just loafing along. So I can definitely end up with a bigger, better video card, like a 6800 or 6800 XT. Now, of course, they are vaporware, and of course, we are running older hardware. It should work, but there's never a guarantee when it comes down to that. Although I'd still try it if I could get my hands on one, which is the big thing, because right now we're getting up at Christmas and there's a bunch of adulting stuff going on behind the scenes, of course. So I'm gonna have to run this thing the way that it is, and I really hope that it is going to be able to run Cyberpunk 2077. I have roughly the same amount of adjustability in the settings there, and I can see and compare how this game does versus Cyberpunk 2077. Cyberpunk 2077 is also running at a upgraded graphics engine as opposed to The Witcher 3, so hopefully it is just a little bit more optimized, which should help the older hardware out. We will see. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, hashtag game for the sake of gaming, and I will see you guys on the flip side.